It's important to keep an eye on Joe Biden's policy proposals because, on the one hand, you have Donald Trump holding huge rallies as if there's no pandemic while insulting Joe Biden, saying Joe Biden is stupid, as he did earlier this week. And then on the other hand, as a contrast, you have Joe Biden actually proposing some pretty interesting policies. And one such policy that Joe Biden recently released is a 10% tax penalty on companies that move operations overseas. And then on the other side of that, a 10% tax credit for companies that create jobs in the United States. I like the idea of Joe Biden rolling out more economic policies because if you're someone who's voting on the big picture, right, you realize Donald Trump is a completely incompetent systemic threat to the United States and the world, and he's made the country a global laughingstock. You may already be clear on, I'm voting Biden in November. There are people who, for one reason or another, need some more specific economic justifications to vote for Joe Biden. And one of those is that Joe Biden says he will reverse some of the worst policies of the Trump administration, which he believes are loopholes that allow offshoring to take place, despite Donald Trump claiming his entire campaign and during his presidency that he would be and has been great for the American worker and for American business. It's impossible to ignore the reality that Joe Biden on some of these issues is saying he will achieve the exact same thing Donald Trump promised to achieve when he was campaigning, which is Joe Biden, much like Donald Trump said in 2015, says he will revive American manufacturing. Joe Biden, much like Donald Trump campaigned on in 2016, says he will create more American jobs and bring some supply chains back to the United States. Of course, you will notice that the reason Joe Biden is saying he will do those same things is Donald Trump promised to do them but failed to do so. And Joe Biden's new proposal will target offshore profits now. And then this is going to, bigger picture, get added into his plan to require corporations to pay at least a 15% minimum tax on domestic profits. As many of you know, even though we have a corporate tax rate here in the United States with no required minimum tax on corporations the way individuals have, there's something called the alternative minimum tax for individuals, meaning you can't use deductions and loopholes to get down to not owing anything. That, in theory, that's the point of the alternative minimum tax. Joe Biden is proposing something similar for corporations. On the other side of this is you've got on one side a 10% tax for offshoring, and then you have a 10% made in America tax credit, which you would qualify for if you as a business owner revitalize a closed or almost closed facility in the United States, if you expand a facility, if you bring some production back to the United States. And there will also be a 10% credit available if you increase manufacturing wages. It has to be based on pre-coronavirus as a baseline, up to $100,000. This is super interesting. Let me give you an example of how it works. You could conceivably have an employee earning $50,000. And you could say, I'm going to give them a raise to $60,000. On that $10,000 raise, Biden's proposal is the government will kick you back 10% of it. So you give a $10,000 raise, the government gives you a $1,000 tax credit. So you give someone $10,000, it only costs you $9,000. That's very, very interesting. And, you know, the macroeconomic impact needs to be scored. But conceptually, it's very interesting. Now, I wonder how many of you are waiting to see whether I will do this. I would be a hypocrite if I didn't point this out when Joe Biden says it, because I sure as hell pointed it out when Donald Trump said it. All of the talk about bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States, a lot of these jobs are not coming back, period. It doesn't matter if Donald Trump is president. It doesn't matter if Joe Biden is president. And, you know, a 10% credit here, a 10% tax there, it's not going to do it. And that is because the United States made the decision implicitly decades ago that we are going in the direction of being more of a service-based economy, more of a creative economy, and outsourcing manufacturing to places where it's cheaper, like China. That's the reality. And that's a global reality that's bigger than 10% tax here or 10% credit there. Now, that being said, if this incentive got American companies to, for example, move a call center back to the United States, that is much more plausible and I would find super interesting. For me, one of the biggest customer service nightmares is when you're trying to deal with something sensitive. For example, banking, payroll, airline tickets, internet security, and customer service centers are located in other parts of the country, which is fine other than when you're dealing with people that do not speak English at a certain level of proficiency. That really affects customer service. And when you look at internet service providers that offshore call centers, when you look at airlines and all of these others, consistently, it destroys the customer experience. We've had recent internet problems. Our internet service provider's tech support is in another part of the world, run by mediocre English speakers. They're not bad people. They're no worse than Americans, but it is not a great customer service experience. At one point, the payroll company we used to have had customer service overseas. It's not a great experience to be trying to set up, the proper tax deductions for employees and to have someone where you don't even know if their English level is at a level of proficiency where they're getting what you're trying to do. If this idea gets call centers back in the United States, that would be super interesting, and it would be really good for a lot of companies. In any case, we're going to continue tracking Joe Biden's proposals. This is an interesting one. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is doing rallies and calling Joe Biden stupid. You decide which approach you prefer. I know which one I prefer.